Welcome to Feminist Founders, a podcast that explores how to create a more equitable world through entrepreneurship. I'm your host, coach and journalist Becky Mollenkamp. Feminist Founders is a listener-funded podcast. Your contributions enable me to continue bringing you these important conversations without corporate advertising. To support the mission, head to feministfounderspodcast.com and sign up for a paid subscription. The link is in the show notes. Now, on to today's show. Be prepared to have your blood boil. Maybe not. The numbers that you're about to hear in this episode that the guest is going to share about the disparities that we already know exist inside of funding and businesses are probably not terribly surprising, but hearing them all so quickly really got me mad. And I hope it gets you mad too, because I want you to know that you are part of the change. You are part of what helps us shift what has been and create what can be for business for those of us who have less privilege. And so today I am speaking with Erika Lucas. She's an amazing person who I met through Threads, and we've had this wonderful conversation about funding and finances and money inside of startups and entrepreneurial space. She is the person who started Vest, which is a peer network for women professionals that are helping to invest and fund women-led companies that are at the intersection of the care economy and the future of work. She also is the founder of Stitch Crew, which provides capital and a lot of other resources to new majority entrepreneurs. She's a thought leader. She's brilliant. She has done a lot of work inside of the funding space and continues to. And I'm really excited for you to hear this conversation. And I hope that it gets you excited about being part of the change that will make these numbers that she talks about finally shift. So I hope you enjoy our conversation. Hello, Erika. How are you? Thanks for being with me.
Thank you so much for having me, Becky. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while.
Good. Well, we're going to talk a lot about funding, but first I start every episode the same, which is tell me about your relationship with feminism.
You know, it's funny because obviously right now our one of the pillars of our organization focus exclusively on funding women-led companies and funding companies actually that make it easier for women to join the labor force, to join and stay in the labor force. So I become more acquainted and more close to feminism. I've always considered myself a feminist, but I don't think I've ever really explored the full context of what it means to be a feminist and an intersectional feminist at that, right? Because I'm Latina, immigrant, and you know, I think that maybe not necessarily a discomfort, I would say, but my lack of understanding how feminism has evolved over time and how it's excluded in a lot of ways, a lot of women of color. I think it's something that I'm still, wrapping my head around it and being intentional about learning more so that I can be truly a feminist in all sorts of ways, right? And very intentional about it.
I want to speak with people who are all along the journey of understanding their relationship with feminism. So I think that's great. Well, let's get into business. Your background includes marketing and business development. You worked as the global director at the Oklahoma Department of Commerce. Oklahoma is where you are now. And you were also a partner for a long time in a private equity firm. And you have a lot of experience that is more traditional sort of employment. You were born in Chihuahua, Mexico, to parents who were both entrepreneurs. They bootstrapped their businesses to provide for their families. And so I'm wondering, how did your background as a child and seeing your parents as entrepreneurs, and then you went into traditional employment, but eventually you started your own companies. So what made you go into traditional employment having seen entrepreneurship, and then what made you decide to leave it?
Honestly, I wanted nothing to do with entrepreneurship. Because I had seen firsthand, I think that right now in today's environment, we romanticize a lot with being an entrepreneur. And often the way in which Main Street media tells the story of entrepreneurs, the lone wolf, self-made billionaire, and all of these stories that we are told over and over and over, there's actually a lot of inconsistencies with those stories, right? And a lot of people don't have the leverage that enable a lot of the stories to come true. And so I think because I was born into a family of bootstrap entrepreneurs, as you said, that, in Mexico didn't have a lot of resources, didn't have a lot of access to capital. We didn't even know what the hell venture capital meant. So I grew up with a very real definition of what it's like to be a bootstrap entrepreneur, not knowing whether you're going to make payroll or not knowing whether you're going to have the financial resources to keep going. And so I wanted nothing to do with entrepreneurship because I saw the risk. I saw how much work it takes to build a sustainable company. And honestly, back in the day, I just wanted to have a steady paycheck. I wanted to have, health care taken care of by the employer. And I wanted a more stable environment. I'm actually an immigrant, so I also migrated to the United States. There's a lot of uncertainty that goes with a lot of that. And I also felt the weight in my shoulders to make sure that I was taking care of my mom and my family and pay it forward, right, for all the sacrifices she made. So I wanted to take a less risky approach to how I was going to build generational wealth.
I think it can go one of two ways when we have entrepreneur parents. You can either kind of say, oh, that opens the door for me and I can do anything. I can start my own business. Or you can say, oh my gosh, I saw how hard it was for them. I don't want to do that. Because my mom was an entrepreneur and it was very hard. And I think that was what took me a while. Also, it took me down the road of traditional employment. So then what made you decide to leave that security? And we all know once you become an entrepreneur and start to understand things, the security of a traditional job is not always as secure as we make it out to believe, or the story makes it out to be. But what made you decide to leave that so-called security and start something on your own then?
I think like a lot of women in the workforce right now, I think you reach a point when you start observing the workplace in a more realistic way. And then you start realizing that workplaces weren't designed with women in mind, with working parents in mind, with caregivers in mind. I also, obviously, again, talking about the intersectionality, I started realizing that I was often not just the only woman at the table, but the only woman of color at the table. I started, paying attention to the biases, microaggressions, and honestly, I was burned out. I was burned out of that work environment. I knew I was not going to be able to change it, even though, for a long period of time in my career, my ego would tell me, oh, you can go into these workplaces and change it from within. And the reality is a lot of times, we're building our careers and, climbing the ladder, if you will, but sometimes the ladder is stacked against the wrong building, right? And I realized that. I also realized how, because at the time that I decided to leave traditional employment, I was at a private equity firm that was investing in latter stage companies. So control ownership, very different than what I do now because I invest in very early stage companies. But I started paying attention of how disproportionately the flow of capital goes, right? With less than 2% of venture capital going to women, less than 1% going to people of color. And then I started really studying and researching why that was, right? How can it be that women represent 50% of the labor force, 50% of the population? We control more than 80% of consumer spending. The S&P 500 consistently says that companies with women at the C-suite level consistently outperform companies that don't have diversity at the C-suite. So the numbers just didn't jive, right? And I wanted to do something about it. So I took the leap. I think it was just a compounding effect, right, of things like realizing that the workplace really wasn't working for me, realizing that the problem started with who's building and funding companies from the beginning, right? And wanting to do something about it.
Can you paint a little bit more of a picture of what it looked like for you at the end of that? It sounds like you had children maybe by then, you said you were sort of reaching that place of burnout. What were the expectations on you? How much were you working? What did it start to look like for your life?
I was very privileged in that I married a feminist guy, right? Without knowing that he was a feminist. He really did help a lot with caregiving. Both of my roles when I was working for the Department of Commerce here in Oklahoma and when I was at private equity and we were investing both in companies in the US and Europe, I was traveling internationally consistently. And so my husband really stood, he was an entrepreneur, so he had the flexibility to be able to fill in the role of caregiving, right, and household management when I was gone. So I want to say that I was very privileged and that I had a partner that really stepped up and provided that support to enable me to work the crazy hours that I worked, and to allow me to fit in, if you will, into the workplace. But the expectations just were unrealistic because, right now, more than 77% of high earning men have a support system at home versus only 22% of women, high earning women, right? And so the expectation was always that I could go to all the happy hours, same as my colleagues, that and I didn't, and there was somebody going to magically cook for my kid. Or, provide, the whatever. And again, I was very lucky to have a partner that did step in and provided that. But there's only so much you can do, right? Like there's only so much that, the expectations of travel, when you can travel, the expectations of, how you network and how you build your network of going to happy hours and going to weekend events and jumping on a plane just for fun to go visit high net worth individual that might invite, all of those things. It just became too much. Couple that with, so it's not just the expectation of, the work environment and what you're expected to do as a C-suite professional, but also the microaggressions, right? Or the backhanded compliments, right? Like, so for example, one of our perks at the firm that I was at was we would take all-inclusive trips to the beach, and I was the only person there. My husband was the only non-male executive, right? He was there as the spouse of Erika Lucas, and everybody else brought their significant other, which was female at the time, and just a lot of comments that were made, right? That either diminish my husband's contribution or presence during those deals or mine, right? There was a lot of gossip around as to how I got to my role, whether, I was fooling around with some of the partners, because how could it possibly be that a Latina, as young as I was at the time, I'm not that young anymore, had made it to the top in a private equity firm, right? Just because, if you look at it, and I can see why people would raise eyebrows. Latinas represent less than 1% of venture capital professionals, right? So it is very rare to see somebody like me as a partner at a private equity firm. We can go all hour here, Becky, honestly, just talking about how I felt in terms of expectations, but also microaggression, backhanded compliments, and just honestly feeling that it didn't matter what I did and how I showed up and how I consistently outperformed peers. I was never able to going to be enough to be able to really have the same leverage that my male peers did, right? Even if we had the same titles.
Yeah, we could go a long time talking about this, obviously, and I think listeners will relate. Anyone who's worked in corporate America, certainly anyone who's advanced in the way you have, will recognize that experience of being the odd person out. Like, why am I the one? Because I'm different than others in the room. And we're not talking about the 1950s, the 1980s. We're talking about not even that long ago, right? This was
2016. Yeah, 2016.
Right.
And
we're not even talking a decade ago.
Exactly. And I think that one of the things that I did realize about myself is that I tried to do everything that people tell you to do to fit in, right? I achieved for perfectionism, right? I worked extra hours. I showed up every time I needed to show up. I alienated myself, and did all of the things to the point that I think I assimilated myself, right, into this workspace that I didn't really belong in. And it still didn't pay off. I still got burned out because there's only so much you can do. I was doing unpaid labor at home and I was doing unpaid labor at work. And on top of all of my work, my traditional work expectations. So how can you not get burned out? I mean, right now we're seeing it, right? 50% of women in the C-suite are burned out and are either considering downshifting their roles and or quitting the labor force in general. One of the statistics I often mention, because I'm very intentional about investing in Black women, Latinas, and traditionally underrepresented women founders. And I'm very proud to say that Latinas are launching companies 6 times faster than any other group and demographic. But I also know the reason why that is, right? And that's because they're quitting traditional corporate America, traditional workspaces, because they're not serving them. So in one way, I'm proud that women are taking control of their future and starting companies and all of that. But I also challenge, my my colleagues in corporate America and traditional workspaces to really think about why is it the women are leaving the labor force to start businesses. And I think a lot of it has to do because we really haven't created the environment and the workplaces that provide flexibility, not just in terms of where we work, but when and how we work.
I think your experiences give you an amazing perspective to bring into the work you're doing now, because those microaggressions, the overwork, all of the stuff is also the things that the people that you are probably talking to are experiencing, whether it's because they have been experiencing it in their own jobs and are thinking, I got to find a way out of this and I want to start a new company. And also then when they go to look for funding and are running into those same microaggressions and those same issues from traditional funding resources, because as you mentioned, they're very male dominated. So you started Stitch Crew. You've co-founded 2 companies, and we're going to talk about Vest as well. But let's start with Stitch Crew, because that was when you said, I can't take this anymore. This just isn't working for me. Forget security. It's time for me to say, all that be damned, I just need to go work for myself. Tell me a little bit about Stitch Crew and how that was the first place you landed. Why that?
To be honest, it wasn't like one day I, got up and said, oh, this is exactly what I'm going to do. It was a correlation of things. I actually tried to convince traditional economic development organization, my former employer, the Oklahoma Department of Commerce, chambers, universities. Universities were doing it to an extent, but they were very inward focused. So they were supporting students that wanted to start their own enterprise or their own company, right? But very specific to their student body or their faculty. And I went to different organizations because I didn't want to start. I didn't know how, right? I didn't know how to start a nonprofit. I didn't know all that was needed. And again, I was still looking for stability, just more flexible stability, right? But everybody told us no. Everybody, at the time, I think nowadays you're starting to see more chambers and economic development organization focus on entrepreneurship. But back then, a lot of them weren't. And that's because the way we measure economic development in a lot of states and a lot of cities is based on job creation, not wealth creation. And so the problem was that every time I would talk to a traditional EDO, they would say, well, Erika, what you're doing is cute and it's noble, but it's not really economic development at scale, right? We're focused more on helping establish big companies or recruiting and attracting big companies to create, hundreds of jobs instead of like organic growth like you're trying to do. So at the time, a lot of people told us no. But you know who said yes to us? So I was having coffee, probably drinks, not necessarily coffee, with some of the executives. So I'm based in Oklahoma City, and our MBA team, the Oklahoma City Thunder, has a very similar story in that really, for an MBA, especially nowadays, for an MBA franchise, to be approved to own an MBA team, you have to be in a larger market, right? So Oklahoma, by all means, didn't really fit the standards of, what it would take to make an MBA team sustainable. But the Oklahoma City Thunder, took the leap, and Oklahoma have been successful in a lot of the ways that they've been able to sell out at almost every game is because they really integrated into the community. And they also understand that it's more than just selling as sports teams. You really have to be vested in the community, and you have to provide opportunity for people then to be able to be long-term vested in the team. And so we were having drinks and I was telling them my frustration that everybody was saying no and that we were losing a lot of talent to the coast because a lot of young talent didn't think that we were progressive enough in terms of how we were looking at economic development, in terms of providing support systems in our city, in our state. And so they were living to the coast to build those support systems. And the Oklahoma City Thunder immediately got it, right? And they were like, well, what if we helped you do it? So if all these people are saying no, what if we did it and we create a program and we give you the space and we give you our resources and we'll start. And that's how Stitch Crew got started, over drinks, talking about how we could leverage resources. But it wasn't something that I specifically, thought about and build a business plan around. It was just very organic and it was built out of frustration with the system. And then little by little, we started getting other corporate funders and federal funding. And we've never to date gotten state funding, but, city funding and other support mechanisms to continue to do the work that we're doing.
And that work includes an accelerator. Are there other pieces inside of that, or is the primary focus around helping these businesses get off the ground?
It's evolved. We started with one accelerator. We've now actually done 5 different accelerators. We've created the Indigenous Women Accelerator. We created the Inclusive Beauty Accelerator. We've created the Latino Accelerator. So we've Women's Health Accelerator. So in terms of programming, it's evolved to be a lot more inclusive and always center around where are the biggest gaps in terms of, what type of companies need to exist today, and what are the problems that need to be solved and how do we create programming to kind of bring or stitch together the resources needed for these entrepreneurs. So programming is a big part of what Stitch Crew does. The other component of what Stitch Crew does is that we also focus on advocacy, right? So really informing federal, state, and local leaders and economic developers now on the value of backing entrepreneurs, right? And growing organically in our communities. But also we talk about what are the policies that need to exist to make it easier for people to launch a business and to grow a business and to be sustainable, right? And that's not just access to capital. Healthcare, for example, access to healthcare is a big component. A lot of entrepreneurs, the second reason or the second fear for people to launch their business, obviously the first one is loss of income, right? Steady income at the beginning. But the second one is access to healthcare because, insurance, health insurance, it's, this for most households, the second largest expense after, mortgage. So we do a lot of advocacy across the country now to educate people on what policies could help lower the barriers to entry for a lot of entrepreneurs, primarily socially and economically disadvantaged entrepreneurs.
The healthcare issue is definitely one of them because that is always one of the first things that people who are traditionally employed who are miserable, and I will talk to them and they want to start their own business, and it always comes back to that, especially if they are not in a partnership where a partner can provide that. The Affordable Care Act seemed to have helped some. It allowed more people to say, I have some option that is not exorbitant, but it's still exorbitant. So, yeah.
It's still expensive, right? And it's still very, there's just a lot of intricacies, that come with that, that I think we should be talking about it.
And do you guys provide funding, or was this, because I know some accelerators, there's some funding, others there's not, or you provide education around finding funding. Where do you guys fall through Stitch Crew? Obviously with Vest, I know that's very different because it's about funding. But for the Stitch Crew piece of what you're doing, what's the funding component?
When we started, literally, my husband and I put together our own funding because everybody was telling us no. So when we started out, it was mainly bringing together resources, partnerships, investors to the table and all of that. But now we've evolved to do provide non-dilutive financing or grants. I'm sorry, not even financing because they're just grants. But now through a lot of our programs, what we do is, they're still small grants. So I think our biggest grant is $15,000. So it's not a lot of money. And we realize that that's not going to make a dent in somebody's, need for capital. But it's actually grants are, one of the primary sources of early stage capital, primarily for women and people of color, right? That can't secure loans, that can, secure the typical friends and family round that, it's full of biases, and or, private investment. So we provide anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 to each of the company that we support. They don't have to pay it back. It's just something that we ask them to, put towards the development and growth of their company. And we still provide access to mentorship, relationships, networking, peer-to-peer mentorship, and all of that stuff.
What types of businesses are most attracted to those accelerators?
We've been very lucky to attract both venture-backed companies and non-venture-backed companies, Main Street businesses. I think because of the fact that we don't take equity in the companies, but we do. I mean, if you talk to, and it's not just me talking, but if you talk to anybody that has gone through our programming, I think one of the things that we pride ourselves in is community and like just a peer-to-peer support. And so I think that because of that reputation and because of the fact that we don't take equity in the companies, we've actually been able to support companies that have already raised like over $4 million in capital, right? But they're still lacking that peer-to-peer support or that additional introduction to, peer networks. And with Stitch Crew, you leverage the fact that we've supported over 200 companies, so our alumni network is very big, but also our mentor network. And then we have Best, which we haven't even talked about, but that's a network of professional women that are in the C-suite VP that are often acting as mentors, but also pilots, right? Like if you're building something for enterprise solution, a lot of our VAST members are testing out this technology before it goes to market and providing feedback to the founders. So there's a lot more than just capital when it comes to our programming. And because of that, we've been able to attract even companies that are like post-seed and venture-backed because they're not having to dilute, their company to just go through our program. And they still get the $15,000 plus everything else. But we've also been able, I think a lot of things is a lot of companies that are not necessarily looking to be the venture route and have already gotten like their SBA certification and stuff, like they are also turned down by a lot of these for-profit accelerators because they're not venture backed, right? Or because they're not looking to be venture backed. So we get a lot of those companies too, right? That are more Main Street, that want to grow through revenue or want to grow through debt financing or non-traditional sources of financing. We attract a lot of those as well.
Well, you mentioned technology. Some of the folks through Vest trying out the technology. Are they all tech companies or are you also invest? No, okay. Other types of companies as well?
No, we're very intentional about that. We don't want to be like the traditional tech is going to save the world and only tech is going to save the world. We want to help good business owners that can grow sustainably, that are solving a real problem, that are wanting to build intentional companies, that understand that we can use the systems that we have to build more inclusive workspaces and be more intentional about how we take care of employees. So we are not necessarily focused on tech versus non-tech or venture-backed versus non-backed. We're just focused more on the type of founder and the type of company and the type of problem that they're solving.
I want to go back to a couple of things you said and how they relate to each other, which was one about you being sort of, what I heard was, I was a good girl. I did everything the right way. I did what I was supposed to do. And it wasn't working for me. It didn't feel good. My life wasn't the way I wanted it to look. And I have heard this theme, that particular theme, come up again and again in interviews, especially with women for the show, this experience of I did everything that they said I was supposed to, and I wasn't happy. It didn't feel like I thought it was going to. And you also mentioned the lone wolf self-made billionaire narrative. And I feel like these two things kind of go hand in hand, because this idea that if we do everything right, that we can just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, if we do the things we're supposed to do, that we can have that American dream, we can, get rich and all of that. And that narrative gets really perpetuated when we see people talking about, when we hear the self-made millionaire or billionaire story. And you had a TEDx talk, which I'll link to in the show notes, which was great, talking about this. I want you to just share a little bit more about this idea of these like tech guys that, start their business in their garage and now they're billionaires, why that story is deceptive and why it's harmful.
My mom came here as an immigrant, and when she first came here as a single mother, worked 2 jobs. Nobody worked harder than my mom, right? And that didn't, the whole story of like, if you just, put your head down and work very, very hard, and you can become a millionaire. I mean, that is just not realistic, right? Not if you don't have the right type of access to capital, resources, educational, and all of these things. And if you're not exposed to, the different level of opportunities that exist. So I always, right there, I think that if we look at our teachers, if we look at caregivers, nurses that work, single mothers that are working or single dads that are working, 2 jobs plus weekends and all of that, I think that in itself will dismantle that myth. But let's talk about entrepreneurship, and by the way, I don't mean to diminish anybody's accomplishments or achievements, but rather I want us to be very honest about how some people achieve success, right? Often the media tells us that, the story of the Jeff Bezos, the Mark Zuckerberg, the Elon Musk, and how they started with very limited resources, very limited access to capital in their garage. We've all heard these stories. But the reality is most of these males went to Ivy League school. They had generational wealth. They had friends and or family that were able to invest in their company. And they're used to failure, right? Which is very important. Women and people of color don't have the same latitude to fail than white male peers. It's just a fact. We've seen it with the WeWork founder, right? That he failed massively. We've seen it with Sam, with FTX, with several times. These guys have the luxury of failing upwards because, they fail terribly. They even, are not honest with their investors. And immediately they start racing again and they get funding immediately. Yet, even though women represent 50% of the population, all of the statistics that I just mentioned, how is it possible that we only get 2%? With 2% of venture capital, you can't tell me that women have the same latitude to fail than men. It's just not, that the math doesn't support that. And again, going back to these gentlemen, they started with a lot of privilege, right? A lot of all of the things that I mentioned. And even if they fail, they could start over again. Right. And that is fantastic for them. Again, I'm not here to diminish them, but the truth is that most Americans don't have that type of leverage, right? Particularly when it comes to women and people of color. Furthermore, I think that one of the most damaging stories that has taken place in entrepreneurship and in our society, to be honest, is that we idolize these gentlemen. And we think that once you hit the billionaire mark, you must be the smartest person in the room. And I think Elon Musk has proven us wrong, or those that think of the wrong, right? And I'm not saying that he's not smart in some areas, but he didn't build Tesla alone, right? He didn't build, well, he sure as hell didn't build Twitter or X and now, but you know what I'm saying? You need employees, right, that are smart and that are contributing. You need investors that are investing and giving you the funding that you need. You need customers that are buying into the solution. You need stakeholders. I mean, come on, Tesla and, SpaceX wouldn't be here if it wasn't for government funding and government contracts. That's public support. So nobody builds companies alone. And when we idolize these gentlemen and they end up doing a lot of damage to our society, a lot of people are not paying attention to the damage caused. And they only hear the story of the lone wolf and they think that is the only way to entrepreneurship and to building a company, the hustle mode that can be very toxic. And they start building companies that way. I can't stand that argument because one is false. Again, nobody builds companies alone. Two, it's toxic, right? And it's led a lot of founders to, kind of become kind of even like cultish. Like there's just one way to build companies, and whatever Elon says, whatever Mark says, whatever Jeff says, it's the only way to build, and it's not true.
I absolutely think that this needs to be said, and thank you for sharing it. And it even extends further, which I think is where you're talking about, which is it's not even just that they believe it to be true for themselves or for the world, for themselves and the way they must build a business, but they project it outward, right? So it becomes, this is the way everyone should be running a business. And if you're not successful, woman, person of color, it's because you're not as smart or you haven't worked as hard. And they can actually internalize this to a place of truly believing, hey, the reason that less than 2% of venture capital goes to women and less than 1% goes to people of color is just because there aren't enough of those women and people of color who are building businesses. And the unspoken part that I think even sometimes gets spoken is it's because they aren't smart enough or working hard enough. And that is incredibly untrue and damaging. And you mentioned in this TED Talk as well that it's far more systemic, and that doesn't get talked about enough. And so instead what happens is a lot of these funders who are women or people of color are internalizing that narrative and then thinking there's something wrong with them. When in fact, it's systemic issues that get us here and why they're not getting that funding.
Listen, first of all, the first thing I think we need to understand is that inequality compounds, right? When rounds of funding for women-led companies or companies with founders of color are rare, investors start to perceive them as uncommon, right? And what do we do with things as human beings when things are uncommon? We shy away from them, right? Because we instinctively treat them as suspicious. And we put a barrier in between us because, we're uncomfortable. And the result of that is that we make less investments, right? Because it feels unnatural, it feels weird, it feels
unpredictable, and they love predictability.
Exactly. So the risk level goes up. But what happens is, again, inequality compounds because when rounds of funding are rare, investors start perceiving it as uncommon. And so the less rounds of funding, the less, exits, the less role models, the less angel investors or friends and family that can invest. And so the, cycle continues and the spiral continues and inequality compounds, right? The second root cause that I think we don't talk about enough is just the unconscious biases that exist, right? For example, it's very well proven, there's a lot of research that investors and even executives, we judge men based on their potential versus we judge women based on their performance. Right. And so that gives a lot of leverage to male founders who, you're investing based on an idea on a napkin versus a woman. You need to see traction and you need to see how much revenue they have and you need to see what they do and are they credible. One of my biggest pet peeves is also the whole friends and family bias, right? Because a lot of investors says, well, your first round of funding really needs to come from friends and family. That is fantastic if you have friends and family that have wealth to be able to invest in the companies. But when you compare the national wealth average, if a white, and the average white family in the United States is about $280,000 now. If you compare that to a Latino family, it's only about $47,000, dollars, in a Black family, it's about $27,000. So there's a huge wealth gap, and I don't care how great your idea is. If you don't have the friends and family that can invest, it's very hard for you to get that friends and family round. That's another type of unconscious bias. The third root cause that I think we need to talk about is just the incredible disproportionate lack of diversity in the investment space, right? There are several data sets dating back to, 30 years ago that show us that the investment community hasn't really changed for over 30 years, right? And a lot of my colleagues will say, well, Erika, what do you mean? Yeah, there are more women, in venture capital. There are more women investors. There are more women professionals in private equity and venture capital. But just because, we've gotten used to hiring people to check the box or to make our websites look more inclusive, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people with non-traditional backgrounds or socially or economically disadvantaged are making decisions. So when we're looking, for example, at women decision makers in the investment space, it's actually less than 8%, right? And when we look at people of color in the decision making space, it's actually less than 2%. So how can we expect women and people of color to feel welcome into the space or to feel comfortable pitching firms or, all of these? How can we expect to understand, if they're solving for a problem that we're not close to because of their lived experiences, if we don't have diversity in our teams, right? Is it really a lack of deal flow, or is it the fact that we don't know where to look, we don't know what to look for because we don't have diversity in our teams? And again, just going back to disproportionate, I always say it's just unbelievable to me that women control 80% of consumer spending. We make 50% of corporate America purchasing decision making. Yet when it comes to all assets under management, less than 1.4% of all assets under management are managed by diverse owned teams. So both women and people of color, 1.4%, right? So it's just very disproportionate. And until we fix the face of who's writing the checks, we're not going to see a big change in kind of trending number, the numbers trending up when it comes to the flow of capital.
You talk about the people in the room, and obviously there's just the part of like, it's hard to, I think the camaraderie that just happens naturally with somebody who looks more like you, who has a similar life experience as you, who goes and plays golf with your buddies, right? So obviously there's that. But you also mentioned in your TED Talk about somebody who was trying to sell a product or a service to help women with pelvic floor issues after having children. I think about things like period products. I'm thinking about things like women who have different skin tones and cannot find makeup that matches their skin tone or that addresses the texture of their hair. These are real issues that have real money that can be made from them. But if the people in the room don't understand those products, don't understand those life experiences, why would they invest? So it goes beyond just the like, hey, you look like me, because I think sometimes men who don't understand this think, well, I can invest if it's a good product, I'm going to invest in it. It doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman. But it matters beyond just because it's your buddy presenting the product, but because you don't get it.
By the way, Allison, who I mentioned in my TED Talk that's creating that solution, just received FDA approval for her product. So I'm very proud for her. And she's been able to secure investment both from male companies, but also from female.
And what's the product, just so we can give her a shout out?
So it's a product that you can insert, for women that are having urinary problems, right? So it needed to go through FDA approvals. It's a subscription-based model now where you can replace it every 30 days. But it's.
Do you know the name?
Yeah. So it's Allison Conti Products. I think
cool.
is the official name.
No, so that's awesome.
Yes, the product itself is called Yanni, and I can send it to you. So if you want to include it in the show notes, but yeah, I'm very proud of Allison, and she's going. But yeah, to your point, like right now, and you mentioned how did I attach my personal experiencing to my experience? So in addition to Stitch Girl, I also founded VEST, which is a peer network of professional women. And it's cross-generational, cross titles, right? So we have women in the C-suite, VP, but we also have emerging leaders, and we have entrepreneurs, because we believe in the cross-sectional, training and sharing, different lived experiences. And then we launched a fund that invests not only in women-led companies, but women-led companies that are building specifically for, how we're caring for the loved ones, how broken our care infrastructure is in the United States. And also, how are we helping employers better recruit, retain, and upskill workers in a way that creates more inclusive workspaces? So all of that is tied to, my personal story, but also the stories of more than 200 women that we've been able to support either through Stitch Crew or through VEST that tell the same story, and I'm sure you've heard the stories again and again, like we've just talked about. But my point is, when you talk about the care economy, and for those that are listening that really haven't delved into what the care economy is, So think about all the money we spend caring for our loved ones from the time they're born to their last breath, right? So yes, that includes childcare, but it also includes elder care, home-based care, parent tech, household management tech, all of these things. It's a massive industry, over $600 billion industry. So it's actually bigger than the pharmaceutical industry. But when I talk to a lot of LPs, to invest in our fund, they actually don't get it because they immediately think of childcare and how low paying jobs, right? Because of how unequal we are to caregivers. And so they think, no, this doesn't make money, right? This is not big enough. And, yes, childcare is a problem, but it's a problem for the government to solve or for women to solve, right? Not for venture capital to solve. And that is, again, because I mentioned before, when you have over 78% of high earners or, 90% of male investors that have a support system at home, of course, they don't understand how massive the problem is. But when I tell women the problem that we're trying to solve and why it's investable and why there's a lot of opportunity, they immediately get it, right? Because for the most part, for societal norms and other things, women are still the primary caregivers and we're still the primary party responsible for managing our household, right? So I think it just goes back to the point of, it doesn't matter even if you are for investing in women, even if you are for investing in traditionally overlooked entrepreneurs, if you don't have the lived experiences and representation in your team, sometimes it's very hard to see past how big the problems actually are.
You mentioned lack of representation and then very related unconscious bias, because I think those things often show up together, right? And how that has clearly affected funding and where the money's going to. This is where I really wanted to talk about Vest. You've brought it up, so I'm glad you have, because you're trying to imagine a new way. So what needs to change and how? And then let's talk about, and maybe you can do it now, including in that, or maybe it's a separate question, but I want to know how Vest is a part of trying to help create that change.
I think women need to be part of the table, women with different lived experiences, right? So going back to feminism, I think that one of the challenges, I think, with why a lot of women, particularly Black women, Latinas, Indigenous women for sure, feel uncomfortable with feminism is because it's excluded them in a lot of ways. One of the things that we're very intentional about Vest is instead of asking for a seat at the table, we're creating our own tables, right? We're talking about, hey, not only how do we support each other as we navigate careers, but how do we intentionally create more inclusive workspaces that work for everyone, not just women. And that requires us coming together to not try to assimilate to spaces that weren't designed with us in mind, but coming together to talk about how we support one another as we create a different way of building workspaces. We're also creating different ways by the fund, right? By the way, I can't stand venture capital. And if you ask anybody that's ever known me, I never wanted to raise a fund. I was very against, Stitch Crew has always been very intentional about not just being for venture backable companies. The reason I decided to launch the fund is, once again, it was frustration. When we started back in 2016, we started trending little by little, but women started securing more funding, and so there were some years, up to into like 2020, where women were able to secure, and then it just dropped. So we were actually regressing. I feel like oftentimes we take 2 steps forward and then 4 steps back, right? And so I got upset, and to be completely honest, and now it's not that I regret it, but I look back and I was naive and thinking, fuck, we're regressing, so we just need to create a fund. And the way we started, actually, we weren't going to be our target right now is 20 million, but we started small, right? Like the first $2 million came from women in our network, right, and people in our network that were already familiar with what we're trying to do. So that's a different way of, like, again, it was non-traditional LPs. It was high net worth individuals. It was women that understood the problem that we were trying to solve. It was giving them the opportunity to decide which companies needed to exist in the world, right? Not obviously profit driven, but also like we're tired of seeing another, how do we build a life in Mars? Like, okay, that might be a problem that we may need to encounter, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. But how about we create solutions that are needed now, for the majority of the population, instead of like, weird shaped rockets that can go up to, whatever. Um, so I think that's why Vest is important, and that's why it's so important that people with non-traditional backgrounds, women, people of color, start being the ones writing checks, because we see the actual problems that actual people are facing, not necessarily the 1% of the population, right?
So Vest is women in the C-suite and also people of color. Does it include men in the C-suite, just to be clear?
No. So Vest is exclusive to women, or people that identify as women. So no, but investors in the fund that we have do include men that do believe in what we're doing.
So it's not just those women in the C-suite that are the investors in the fund. They also invest in the fund, or I'm just trying to get clarity on how the actual fund works.
So two ways. We have the Women's Peer Network. That's coaching year round and, coming together to provide solutions for them. So that's a separate, that's one pillar. The second pillar is the fund. And yes, some Vest members have invested in the fund, but we now have even brought in institutional investors, including a tribal nation that believes in what we're doing, right? So now we have, several LPs that include high net worth individuals, Vest members, also foundations, and then now a tribal nation that has decided to invest.
And you said somewhere, maybe your TED Talk, maybe somewhere else, that you are a capitalist. So I assume that this is not an altruistic endeavor. I understand Stitch Crew is a nonprofit. Is Vest a nonprofit organization, or is there a profit arm of this?
Vest is a social enterprise in that I wanted to be very intentional. I'm tired of people saying that if women want to contribute to the world, they need to be a nonprofit. I also, we're based in the state of Oklahoma, which is very, very conservative. There's no way that I could have launched Vest and expected funders in the state of Oklahoma to fund us with the mission that we had, right? And so I wanted to be member-led, and it was established as a for-profit organization, but we reinvest all of the membership fees into the network. So meaning nobody's getting rich out of this. It's all going back to the mission. So that's one thing. So Vest is a for-profit, but it's like a social good for-profit that's, we're reinvesting proceeds into the company. And then the fund is a for-profit, but obviously we realize that, the impact is equally as important for us, right? We know that by investing in women-led companies, not only are we helping that 2%, not at scale, but we're helping. But we're also funding the companies that need to exist to enable women not just to join the labor force, but to stay in the labor force, right? So that has a huge, massive impact as well. And we're tracking that in terms of what are the solutions that we're providing employers so that they can take care of their caregivers, the employees that are caregivers. We are tracking how companies are, the overall net positive impact benefit that they're bringing into either employers and or working families.
And you, I know, are interested in reducing that gap between the haves and the have-nots. And you said that you identify as a capitalist. I mean, we exist inside of capitalism, but you also, I think, are very pro-business and pro-wealth generating businesses. So how do you kind of balance that piece in your head between capitalism, wealth generating businesses, and equity?
Yeah, I think there's a balance, right? So I am a capitalist, but I also realize that capitalism hasn't worked for everyone. And I also realize that there's a lot of people that have taken advantage of the system so that only few people benefit from capitalism, right? So like everything, I think that capitalism is not absolute, and that there's a lot of things that we can fix. So for example, I do believe in capitalism, but I also question whether we need to have billionaires exponentially, right? Like the way we have now. I mean, these people are never going to be able to spend this much money. I was talking to a friend that's actually hopefully will become an LP, and she said, I wonder if we can just give people, once you reach $1 billion, if you just get a freaking certificate, just so that you can say you've been there and you've reached that, but then everything else is taxed, right? So that we can take care of like building better systems that benefit everyone, and actually, we can bring back the middle class. So to answer your question, I am capitalist, but I realize very much that it's that there are some fundamental things and systemic barriers that has made it so that not everyone benefits from it. So I have a complicated relationship too with capitalism, if that's fair. And I also think that there needs to be a balance, right? There needs to be a balance where, again, not everybody has benefited from it. If you look at who's funding and who's building the companies of the future, which a lot of them are tech companies, right? AI now, right? With AI, disproportionately, they're being led by male figures, white male figures. They're being funded by white male figures. They're solving problems for white male leaders. And there's a lot, so for example, if you look at studies, 80% of the jobs that AI is going to displace are held by women. Yet, women professionals in AI only represent 22%. And if AI authors, perhaps more importantly, who's actually writing the language for a lot of this things, it's only 14% of women, right? So if we don't change that, and the importance of changing the gap and closing the gap, it's so important, because a lot of the biases that we see today are going to be not just replicated, but at scale, right, with AI, if we are not intentional about making sure that these systems and these languages are not actually doing more harm than good.
It's been very interesting seeing some of the folks, especially women of color, who have been looking at AI and some of the potential issues and already issues around racism and other things inside of what's AI is generating as it is now, and who knows how it could potentially cause even bigger problems. So I think it's a really good point.
I'm definitely a pro. I'm not afraid of technology, right? And I do see how technology can benefit can support a lot of solutions that are needed in today's market. I'm afraid of people, right? And how people are
creating AI.
Exactly. I think it's not the technology that I'm afraid of. It's just how people are going to use it, how people are going to build it, what people are going to use it for. And by the way, I think that we also as women need to keep each other accountable, right? And so, as much as I want to see more women-led companies, I also question, like, how do we set accountability systems for ourselves as well? I'm a big fan of Bumble, by the way. So getting out that, I'm a big fan of Whitney. But, in the last tech summit, she was talking about how now we're going to create bots that date other bots. And then once those date bots decide that it's good for us to meet, we're going to create. And that's how we're going to solve loneliness. And I was just like, what? Does it really solve loneliness? Or is it really just helping the bottom line of the company? And I think we need to create systems that are, for accountability for ourselves as well, so that we can all be better and that we are actually using technology to solve real problems. One of my biggest fears right now is how disconnected we're becoming, how polarized we're becoming, particularly when it comes to inclusion and equity, and who gets to be seated at the table. And I'm afraid that if we are only looking at the bottom line and at the profit line, we're only going to we're going to make problems even bigger.
That is where that tension between intersectional feminism and capitalism exists. Because when you teeter too far into that side of capitalism, it can corrupt, right? It corrupts. Greed corrupts us. And then we lose sight of the things that we were committed to. And on the tech piece, I just want to say, it reminds me of like the seatbelt, which is not a super tech tool, but it's the same thing. It was designed by men for men's bodies and then doesn't function for women as well, and not for pregnant women at all. And it's exactly that. It's not that I have a problem with the seatbelt. I think seatbelts are great. The solution can be great. It's who's developing the tool and who are they developing it for. So that's why we need that seat at the table. And speaking of seats at the table, for our bonus talk, we're going to talk about seats at the table on boards, because you're on quite a few boards. And as we talk about throughout this episode about the importance of getting more women, people of color at the seat, getting them a seat at the table, I want to talk a little bit about boards and why that's also important. So we're going to talk about that in the bonus content. So if you're interested in that, make sure you sign up for the newsletter. And I'm going to finish this episode. I had more I wanted to talk about, but I want to honor our time because we said we'd stick to close to an hour. So I'm going to finish by asking you for a resource that you recommend.
I mean, I have to make a plug for Stitch Crew Invest, right? So Stitch Crew has a newsletter as well. And on a monthly basis, we actually talk about all the grants that are available for women and people of color.
Is that just in Oklahoma City or Oklahoma?
No, that's national.
Okay.
And in fact, a lot of our programming is national, just to clarify. And then
perfect.
And then we provide resources, whether it's grants or pitch competitions or even investment firms that we highlight that are nationally in nature. So definitely subscribe to the Stitch Crew newsletter. And then the other resources, with VEST, we actually have our own podcast where we talk about, women at work, right? How are we building more inclusive workspaces? What are the blind spots that executives and workplaces have when it comes to putting women in more in more positions of power and influence?
We'll link to those things in the show notes. And then finally, I asked for an organization that's doing good work in the world. But now that I know that Stitch Crew is nonprofit, I'm assuming that's the one you'd want to highlight.
One of my boards, since we're going to talk about that, one of the boards I served on is actually the Diversion Hub. And it's a fantastic organization that was created to divert individuals from the criminal justice system. Once again, people are always like, why are you there? And I'm like, because if I can make it here, I can make it anywhere, not New York. But, not only is the state of Oklahoma, where I'm based, the worst state in the nation for women, but we're also one of the worst states in the world to criminalize individuals, particularly women. And so this organization, what they're trying to do is put tools and resources together so that people that have, for whatever reason, been in touch with the criminal systems, how they, especially with misdemeanors, how do they, get out of that? What resources do they have so that they can build the systems that they need to get out of the criminal justice system? So I love the work they do. They do so much, and they don't get the recognition that they deserve. I actually hope that they're able to replicate this model in different states.
Well, I will make a donation to Diversion Hub to say thank you for your time and encourage listeners to do the same. I will link to it in show notes. I just will say I have several friends who are either in Oklahoma or have left. And I'm also in a very red state, Missouri. And so I know what you're talking about. It's not, I think we're a little higher on some of those things, but we're like last in the nation on education funding. So we also have our issues. And it's challenging because it's like you were talking about with being in a company. Do you stay inside and try to make change from within, or do you go and try to affect change from the outside? And I feel like it translates the same thing with where we live. And not everyone, the thing that we have to remember is not everyone has that privilege to say, I can leave. And so some people have to stay and try and fight.
Exactly that. And maybe that's one of the main things why I'm still here.
Yeah. And thank you for doing that. Because in a post-Roe world, Oklahoma is a tough state to be in. So I appreciate you staying and doing that work. Yeah. Well, thank you for your time, Erika. This has been really, really wonderful.
Thank you. I really appreciate the questions and the time with you, Becky. I follow you and I love your content that you put out on Threads since I left, X. So really appreciate you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Feminist Founders Podcast. If you like what you heard and want to learn more, or if you'd like to support the work that I'm doing with the show, please visit feministfounderspodcast.com. There you can find out about becoming a paid subscriber for as little as the price of 1 cup of coffee a month, which will directly support my work. Thanks again, and I can't wait for our next episode.